Welcome to Ploughman's Backyard. My name is Kendra and today we're going to be talking about tomatoes and why they're not producing flowers. So some of the things we're going to be looking at is temperature, nutrients, watering, and sunlight. After you plant your tomato plants outside, typically within 3 to 4 weeks, you should start seeing flowers on your tomatoes. We did start off with a few flowers and there is a couple flowers on some of these tomato plants that I have going on, but as you can see, they're very lush, very green, and are growing quite well. Look very healthy, but they're not producing as many flowers as I'd like. I probably see about 1 or 2 flowers on each tomato plant. Your tomato plants, if they are healthy and thriving and lush like mine are, we then know that it's probably it's a little bit maybe too much nitrogen, but we'll get into that a little later. But right now we're going to be looking at temperature. So it has been unusually cool this summer. It is about the 25th or 26th of July. And we haven't had a whole lot of heat. We've had a lot of cool days, a lot of very rainy days, and minimal sunshine. So what this is really showing me, because a lot of these issues that we're going to be looking at with producing flowers or fruit on your tomatoes are typically very easy to correct. So with the temperature, because it has been a bit cooler and hasn't been like excessive heat for any length of time, we might get a couple, like 2 or 3 days of sun in a row, and then followed by maybe 4 or 5 days of cooler temperatures and rain. What this is really showing me is that the plant is really healthy. It's getting good watering. It's not coloring at all. There's no yellowing of the leaves. They're lush and they're very happy. It's kind of like the prime of their life, really, if you can think about it like that. You know how you feel when you're in your 20s or early 30s. You're in kind of the prime of the life. You're doing really well. You know, things are looking really good for you and you're just like living and thriving. So what happens is they are so comfortable at this temperature that they're just living, they're thriving, they're living. A little bit of stress on a plant, such as a length of time of heat can be just enough stress on a plant that makes it want to produce fruit. That it's going to cause that plant to realize that, you know, I better be preparing basically to die, if you want to think of it that way. But it also wants to make sure that it's going to produce offspring. So kind of like as you grow up and, you know, you're getting a little later in life and you realize that you want to settle down, have a family, you want to preserve, you know, your gene line or whatever. That's kind of what the tomato plant's doing. So it's taking the stress in its life, realizing, you know what, I need to produce an offspring so that my gene or type can continue to thrive after this plant is dead. So basically a little bit of stress is causing that plant to want to produce its offspring. It's wanting to produce flowers. And what we needed to do is just cause a little bit of stress, a little bit of heat in order for it to go to fruit, because when it goes to fruit, that's when we benefit from it. So this is showing me that these plants are healthy and thriving. So we need to have a good length of some heat and humidity. You can do that. It's harder to do, you know, it's harder to control your environment, obviously, when we're planting outside. But when you're planting in a greenhouse, that's kind of easy to control. The other thing that you can do is actually do like row covers and cover them up so that that plant is going to get the heat that it needs. And it also gets a little bit of protection, gets a little bit of shade as well. Another thing with tomatoes is when they have a prolonged period of cooler temperatures, they tend to go into survival mode. So, you know, when you get closer to the fall, you're still getting lots of nice ripening up of your tomatoes, but they do stop producing flowers. It's because they're trying to just, you know, preserve the life that they have with those longer stretch of cooler periods. Unfortunately, what has happened to us in this particular area is we've had the longer part or portions of cooler temperatures, but we never had the heat before it. So I'm really hoping that in the next course of, you know, the end of the summer, as we get into August, that we're going to have like a little bit of a stretch of some heat and humidity so that we can bring on the flowers that I need in order to harvest some tomatoes from these plants. The next thing we're going to talk about is watering. So one thing with tomatoes is they like consistent and regular watering. Typically when I do my tomato plants, I typically water when I get them planted into the ground, the initial transplant into the ground, but I don't water that frequently, mainly because here we're at a lower spot on our property and we get lots of good water underneath the soil. However, with all the rain that we have been getting, it hasn't really allowed the soil underneath to warm up and to warm up those good roots. Another thing with overwatering, sometimes you can stunt your plants, you can stunt the growth, and you can make your tomato plants have very shallow root system. So one of the problems with the shallow root system is that the roots are not able to go down deep enough into the soil to get the nutrients that they need. However, by looking at the plants, I do not think that this is definitely not a watering or a deep root issue. It is definitely, I would say, it has very high nitrogen. So with tomato plants, they use a whole lot of nitrogen. Nitrogen, you can tell just by looking at these plants, they're very lush, very dark green. The stalks are very thick. They're very healthy looking, meaning that they are getting a lot of nitrogen and maybe not so much of the like potassium. So even though watering can definitely be an issue, just by looking at the plants, I definitely do not think this is a watering issue. Perhaps it could be more of, like I said earlier, a temperature issue, but I'm thinking that maybe if I get some fertilizer or something to increase the potassium or the phosphorus in these tomato plants, it could really help encourage those flowers in order to come onto my tomato plants. There are ways that you can increase the nutrients in your plants in order to help that plant encourage it to flower. So some of the ways that you can enhance or encourage the flowers to grow by using things like nutrients is you can try bone meal, you can try kelp meal, you can try dressing the ground in a bit of compost, fish emulsion. What I am going to use right now, it's what I have on hand. This specific one here is a fruit and flower blend fertilizer. So I don't always encourage you to be fertilizing during like this time of year. However, because I see that I do have an issue here where I want to increase the flowers on my plants. So what I am using here is a blend. It has very little nitrogen, which is what I want. I do not want any more nitrogen. The first number is a 3, which is the nitrogen. I have a 6 here, which is the phosphorus, and a 12, which is the higher amount is potassium. And that's what you want. You're wanting a lower blend of nitrogen, about a middle ground of phosphorus, and a higher amount of the potassium, which is going to encourage your plants to flower. And that's the blend that I'm going to be using, and I'll be just diluting this in a bit of water and going through and watering these tomato plants. Now the great thing about tomatoes is that they're self-fertile actually, so they don't need to cross-pollinate in any way. One tomato plant, one flower can actually just produce fruit on its own. They just typically need a little bit of wind and some insects. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be cutting back some of the suckers and branches off of these tomato plants down at the bottom to help encourage growth and flowering at the top of the plants. So as you can see here, there is a lot of growth. I have a lot of suckers. I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer and show you exactly what I'm going to do, because as these tomato plants get suckers on the bottom of the plant, it's actually producing a whole entirely new tomato plant that it's going to be giving most of its energy and time into growing a new plant, when up here we're just waiting for some flowers to come on. So if we remove the sucker, which is going to produce a whole nother tomato plant, then that means that instead of focusing all the energy and minerals and nutrients in this plant on this new growth, then that energy can go to producing the fruits and flowers in which we are wanting on these plants. So the other thing that tomatoes absolutely must have is sunlight. So tomatoes need about 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day. And we haven't been specifically getting that here. We've been getting so much rain. I want to say perhaps we've been getting maybe 2 to 3 days of sun max, and all the rest of the days of the week have been pretty much rain and cloudy. As you can see here, we have a very healthy and thriving tomato, but this here is actually a sucker. So I'm just going to remove that just so you can see. So remove that too. So this here is the main tomato branch, or the main stalk that's producing our beautiful tomatoes. This here that you're seeing is the sucker, and you can see how big it's getting. This is what I was talking about. Suckers are actually a whole nother tomato plant. As you can see, it's already starting to want to go and produce flowers. It hasn't yet, which has also stunted the growth of the top of this tomato plant, because now that we have a lot of growth on the top, it is now focusing on trying to produce tomatoes on this other tomato plant. So what we're wanting to do is actually just remove these suckers. And typically I go through and I do this as I'm planting, but it needs to continually be done in order to ensure that we're getting all of the nutrients going up now to the tomato flowers that we want to produce. So here is our brand new tomato plant, a full plant. a clone actually of this one. And what I'm going to do, because as you know, if you've been following our channel, the garden isn't doing specifically well this year because of all the rain and the cooler temperatures. So we have some things that haven't grown. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to actually plant these extra little suckers into some of the empty spaces I have in the garden, and hoping that I'm going to get a full other plants of tomatoes that I can actually utilize. So I'm going to go through, take off all the suckers, and it's actually okay to go through and just remove some of the branches. So what you're actually wanting is that you want a lot of this bottom here to get the sun that it needs, get the heat. So when the bottom stalk of your tomato plant gets the heat that it needs, it really does help encourage that good growth that we want to see on our tomato plants to get good fruit. And obviously, in this case, I'm wanting to get the flowers so that I can then turn get the fruit that I want out of this tomato plant. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you have found it helpful. And if you haven't yet subscribed or hit that notification bell, I hope that you do, because we have some great tips here on how to look after your garden and how to really increase your yields each year when you're gardening.